A stalker turned my life into a nightmare. I fought back, set a trap, and finally got him arrested. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like the change in the air before a storm. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia, a lingering glance on a crowded street, a figure standing too still at the corner, or the same car passing by twice in a day. It wasn't until the coincidences began to stack up that I realized something was wrong. I work as a freelance graphic designer, which means I spend a lot of time at home. My routine is predictable. Coffee at the cafe on the corner in the morning, a midday run at the park, and groceries at the same stall every Thursday. Maybe that's why it was so easy for someone to follow me. I'd made myself an easy target. The first time I felt truly watched was on a grey November morning. The cafe was unusually quiet, and as I sat by the window sketching ideas for a project, I noticed a man sitting on the bench outside. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting, his face obscured by a hood and a baseball cap. Something about the way he didn't move, didn't even check his phone, set my nerves on edge. When I left, he was gone. I laughed it off. Just a guy waiting for someone, I told myself. A week later, I saw him again, this time at the park during my run. He wasn't on the path, but near the edge of the woods, leaning against a tree. The hood and cap were the same. His posture was too casual, like he was trying to blend in, but didn't quite know how. I slowed my pace, pretending to tie my shoe, and glanced his way. He was staring directly at me. I left the park early that day, my pulse pounding harder than it had from the run. For the first time, I checked behind me on the walk home, scanning every corner and shadow. Nothing, no one. Over the next few weeks, he became a ghost haunting my periphery. He'd be on the other side of the street when I went to the store, or standing at the far end of the cafe, sipping from an empty cup. Once, I swear I saw him in my neighborhood at night, leaning against a lamppost 2 houses down. When I blinked, he was gone. My friends told me I was overthinking it. City life is full of weirdos, Anna said over dinner one night. They're harmless 99% of the time. Just ignore him, ignore him. How do you ignore someone who seems to be everywhere you are? A month in, the notes started. They weren't overtly threatening, but they weren't friendly either. The first one was tucked into my jacket pocket while I was at the cafe. A single sentence written in blocky, uneven letters. You look lost today. The second appeared in my mailbox, folded neatly between 2 bills. I hope you smiled today. Each note left me more unnerved than the last. I started double locking my doors, keeping the curtains closed, and avoiding my usual haunts. Still, the notes kept coming. One was taped to my front door, another left on the hood of my car. My heart was in a constant state of panic. I stopped going out alone and even considered moving, but the thought of packing up my life just to escape this faceless presence felt too overwhelming. Besides, what if he followed me there too? The moment I stepped into the grocery store, I felt it. That heavy, suffocating sense of being watched. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly glow over the aisles. I tried to shake the feeling, busying myself with checking expiration dates and comparing prices, but my hands trembled as I reached for a carton of eggs. Then I saw him, or rather, the back of his hooded figure. He was at the end of the aisle, pretending to study a shelf of cereal boxes. My stomach churned. I left my cart and headed straight for the exit, keeping my pace steady, even as my instincts screamed at me to run. Outside, the air was biting cold, but I barely felt it. I walked briskly, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The street was mostly empty, but a shadow moved behind me, the echo of footsteps growing louder. I turned a corner and ducked into an alley, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I pressed my back against the wall, willing my heart to stop pounding. The footsteps slowed, then stopped, silence stretched out, thick and unbearable. Peeking out, I saw him standing at the mouth of the alley, silhouetted by a street lamp. He didn't come closer. He just stood there, his head tilted slightly, as if daring me to make the next move. That night, I barely slept. I kept all the lights on, sitting in my living room with a kitchen knife in my lap, listening for every creak and rustle. The hours dragged, and by the time dawn broke, I was a wreck. I called the police, but they weren't much help. Unless he's made a direct threat, there's not much we can do, the officer said over the phone. Keep your doors locked and stay vigilant, as if I wasn't already jumping at every shadow, every sound. But this was more than just vigilance, now it was survival. 4 months, he had chipped away at my sense of safety, turned my life into a maze of fear. I didn't know what he wanted or why he'd chosen me, but I was done waiting to find out. Something had to change, and if the police wouldn't help, I'd figure it out myself. I spent the next few days preparing. If the police wouldn't step in, I'd have to take matters into my own hands. I dug through online forums about stalking and personal safety, looking for advice that went beyond stay alert, cameras, alarms, even self-defense classes. It felt like I was turning my home into a fortress, but at least it gave me a sliver of control. Yet none of it stopped him. The man in the hood still lurked in my life like a shadow that refused to leave. Each time I saw him, it was like a warning, as if he were waiting for me to crack. But I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I decided to turn the tables. If he was following me, I'd lead him somewhere public, where I could face him head-on. Friday night, I stuck to my routine like clockwork: cafe, a short walk around the park, then back toward home. Only this time, I wasn't heading home. I'd mapped out a route to a busy bar just outside the park. My plan was simple: walk there, wait for him to follow, and confront him in front of as many people as possible. As I left the cafe, I could feel him watching me. My heart pounded as I resisted the urge to look back. His presence was a weight pressing on my spine, his footsteps a quiet echo behind mine. I crossed the street, slowing just enough to make sure he'd follow. The bar's neon sign came into view, glowing red against the cold night sky. I stepped inside, letting the noise and heat wash over me. I found a spot near the bar, ordered a drink, and waited. It didn't take long. He entered a few minutes later, his hood pulled low, but I knew it was him. He lingered by the door, scanning the room. My stomach twisted when our eyes met. For a moment, he froze, like he hadn't expected me to notice him so quickly. I stood, heart hammering. This was it. "Why are you following me?" I said, loud enough for people nearby to hear. The bar fell quiet, heads turning toward us. He hesitated, clearly taken off guard, and then he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, it was cold, calculated, and to calm. "You're mistaken," he said smoothly, his voice steady. "I don't even know you." The bartender stepped forward, eyeing him suspiciously. "You causing trouble, buddy?" "I'm just here for a drink," the man said, raising his hands as if to surrender. The hood slid back slightly, revealing sharp, angular features. I memorized his face, the high cheekbones, the thin lips, the eyes that gleamed like polished glass. "Stay away from me," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "If I see you again, I'll make sure you regret it." He didn't respond. He just smirked, tipped an imaginary hat, and walked out. The tension in the bar eased, but my heart didn't. That smile haunted me. It wasn't the smile of someone giving up. It was the smile of someone playing a game they thought they'd already won. The next morning, I took the photo I'd snapped of him at the bar and posted it online. If the police couldn't help, maybe the internet could. I uploaded it to a local forum with a message: "This man has been stalking me for months. Does anyone know who he is?" Within hours, the replies started pouring in. Most were sympathetic strangers offering advice, but one comment stood out. "I've seen him before. He used to live near 12th and Briar. Really creepy guy. Heard he's obsessed with people he watches." Obsessed. The word chilled me to the core. I clicked the commenter's profile and sent them a private message, asking for anything they knew. They responded quickly, telling me the man's name was Eric and he'd been kicked out of their building a few years ago for harassing another tenant. It wasn't much, but it was something. I filed a new report with the police, armed with his name and history. They promised to look into it, but their tone was the same as before, indifferent. I couldn't rely on them to stop him. That night, I was on edge. Every creak, every rustle outside sent my nerves into overdrive. I double-checked the locks, tested the security cameras, and tried to distract myself with a movie. But then I heard it soft, deliberate knocking at my front door. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The cameras hadn't triggered any alerts. Gripping the knife I'd started keeping by my side, I crept toward the door. The knocking came again, louder this time. Taking a deep breath, I checked the peephole. He was there, standing just outside, his face illuminated by the porch light. No hood this time, just his smirk, wider and more menacing than ever. "Go away," I shouted, my voice shaking. He didn't move. Instead, he leaned closer to the door and spoke, his voice low and taunting. "You can't hide from me. I always know where you are." I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but when I looked through the peephole again, he was gone. This was no longer about waiting for help or hoping he'd lose interest. I knew Eric wasn't going to stop until I made him. I spent the rest of the night planning my next move. I wasn't running anymore. If he wanted to play this game, I'd make sure I was the one to end it. Eric's taunts had pushed me to my limit. He thought he could keep me trapped in fear, but I wasn't playing defense anymore. Over the next few days, I mapped out a plan, one that would put me back in control. If the authorities couldn't stop him, I would. I knew Eric thrived on control, on watching me squirm. So, I decided to give him what he wanted me. Alone, vulnerable, in a predictable place. It was risky, but it was the only way to end this. The park, where he'd first made himself known, was perfect. There were secluded areas where I could lead him, and the dense woods would give me the cover I needed. I wore a small camera disguised as a necklace, its feed streaming directly to my laptop at home, and carried a stun gun in my coat pocket. I'd let him think I was an easy target until I wasn't. At sunset, I left my apartment, taking my usual route toward the park. I kept my movements natural, but every nerve in my body was on high alert. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, I knew he was there. I could feel it, the prickling sensation of being watched, the faint sound of footsteps trailing too far behind to be coincidence. I stepped off the main path, leading him deeper into the trees. The woods swallowed the last of the light, leaving only the faint glow of the moon filtering through the branches. My breath puffed in white clouds as I pretended to stop and adjust my shoelace, giving him the opportunity to catch up. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. When I stood, he was there, emerging from the shadows like he belonged to them, his face half hidden by the dim light. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice steady despite the fear coiling in my stomach. He tilted his head, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "Because I can. You're so predictable, so easy to read. It's fun." Fun. That single word made my blood boil. He saw this as a game, but I wasn't playing anymore. I stepped back, slowly, luring him toward the clearing I'd scouted earlier. He followed, his movements deliberate, his eyes never leaving mine. "You think you're clever," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "But you can't stop me. You never could." "Maybe not alone," I said, letting the words hang in the air. Confusion flickered across his face right before the sound of sirens pierced the night. The plan had worked. While I led Eric into the woods, the live feed from my camera was being monitored by Anna and the police officer at my apartment. They'd seen his face, heard his voice, and tracked my location. The authorities were finally taking him seriously, and they were closing in. Eric's smug confidence shattered. He lunged toward me, but I was ready. My hand shot into my pocket, gripping the stun gun, and I jabbed it into his side. He crumpled to the ground with a grunt, his body jerking as the voltage surged through him. I backed away as flashlights danced through the trees, voices shouting my name. Within moments, officers surrounded him, pinning him to the ground. Even then, his eyes found mine, filled with a mix of fury and something darker, a promise that this wasn't over. Eric was arrested, charged with stalking, harassment, and attempted assault. The police found enough evidence on him, photos, notes, even video recordings, to ensure he'd be locked up for years. For the first time in months, I could breathe again, but the fear didn't leave me entirely. Even knowing he was behind bars, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left a scar on my life, an invisible mark that would always make me look over my shoulder. Still, I refused to let him win. I started going back to the cafe, the park, and my favorite places. I reclaimed the parts of my routine he had stolen from me, piece by piece. One day, months after his arrest, I found a letter slipped under my door. My heart sank as I unfolded it, dread bubbling up from the pit of my stomach. But the note wasn't from Eric. It was from the officer who had helped me. "You're stronger than you think. Don't let him take anything else from you. He's gone for good." I smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. Maybe the shadows would always linger, but I wasn't afraid of them anymore. If you liked the video, please leave a like, comment and subscribe for more videos like this.